Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flock Talk. I'm Erin Morgan, and I work for the members of the Ontario Sheep Farmers. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Tyler McCann from the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Thanks for joining me, Tyler.
Great to be with you, Erin.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started on the hard-hitting questions? Tell us about yourself, your career. How did you get to your position at CAPI?
So I'm the managing director at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. I've been here for about 5 years now. I've spent my career in and around agriculture policy and politics, largely at the federal level. For about the first 10 years, I worked as a political staffer, most of that time for the federal agriculture minister. And then I did some consulting work and association management work. I've worked for National Farm Group. I've worked for national industry associations. I started my education. I did my diploma in agriculture at McDonald College. After that, I did 1 semester of ag economics. I didn't like that. I did a year and a half of political science. I didn't like that. And so I quit that degree to work in federal politics and haven't looked back since then. And then outside of my day job, my wife and I have a big hobby farm in Western Quebec where we've got 60 cows and 20 goats.
That's cool. All right.
It is. It keeps everybody busy.
Yeah. So tell us about CAPI. What's the mission and what are the current priorities of the organization?
Yeah, so the CAPI is a national ag think tank, and probably a lot of your listeners may not understand what a think tank is, but really it's a place where we try and put forward new policy ideas, new thinking, really trying to kind of bridge the gap between the work that advocacy organizations like the Ontario Sheep Federation does and policymakers that are dealing with their own things in the political parties and other actors in that policy process. And we try and be a little bit independent of all of those different actors and look at things maybe in a different perspective than some people do to try and put new solutions forward. And that's where our mission comes from, is really to advance policy solutions to unlock agriculture's full potential. And we do that through a combination of doing research on things like trade and sustainability. We look at things like productivity and prosperity and risk, which has been a big focus of the work that we do. And throughout it, we do research, we engage different stakeholders. We lean a lot into bringing people together to try and find better solutions together. And then a lot of it's communication. And I think I'm increasingly convinced that that's a more important work that we do, is going out and talking to people in government, talking to other policy stakeholders, but also talking to farmers across the country to help them understand what's going on in the policy landscape today.
Wow, that's really interesting. And yeah, when I was looking over your website and trying to figure out, where to take the interview, first of all, there is so much there. So anybody who's listening, it's a really great place to get lost in lots of cool ideas. And I thought, well, we'll start maybe with the US and what's happening outside of our borders, and then maybe sort of bring the interview back to Canada. So I wanted to first start, obviously, tariffs. Everybody's talking about them. Everybody's talking about a Trump presidency. And your organization in 2024 interviewed producers or surveyed producers to ask them about their concerns with respect to a Trump presidency before the election. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you learned, what the concerns were, and then how those have borne out, since Trump was elected and now we're in the thick of it?
Yeah, it's clearly been a major issue and concern. And agriculture and food in Canada is so export dependent. And even if you're a farmer that's not directly an exporter themselves, you are likely in a value chain that is, again, we've got a sheep industry in Ontario that is largely a domestic industry, but really does rely on kind of that kind of the ability to export to keep things going, to keep things moving. And so we've heard a lot about the concerns around the uncertainty. And I think the more that we've got into this world of actually living in that uncertainty every day, we know that that's a bigger question. It's almost like the uncertainty is doing more damage than the tariffs themselves can do, because people can't plan and people don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so it's opened up for us, this set of questions around what does trade diversification look like? What does domestic risk management and our risk management programs look like? And how do we deal with the United States itself? And what are the new solutions that are there? we've tried to kind of take what we've heard from others and put forward a set of solutions. In early February, we put forward a list of short, medium, long-term actions that we could take. And I do think that one of the things that the tariffs should do in this world that we're living in with this uncertainty of a Trump presidency is bring us actually back to domestic policy and better focus us on what can we be doing in Ottawa and in Toronto and our capitals across the country in our domestic policy landscape to get our own house in order. Because we may not have much influence in Washington, but surely we can have more influence at home. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do and help people better understand when they tell us in our survey work that they don't have much confidence that we can make our policy environment better. How do we better understand what that means? And how do we better put things together to make it work better?
Okay. So when we are talking about the future of Canadian agriculture policy to mitigate the impacts of these tariffs, what is CAPI recommending?
We think about this in the context of short, medium, long term. And I should say that this isn't a case of CAPI recommending things. Our organization's not like a membership-driven advocacy organization where members take positions. We have people write papers. I do a lot of talking on behalf of the organization. We try and pull things together and produce what we would kind of refer to as a what we heard report. And I think that's important just to say that often we believe that there is no kind of one right answer to these things, but we think by putting different ideas and different solutions forward, we can kind of debate them and have a dialogue around what the answers are. But when that comes to that context of the tariffs and what we do, again, we think about it in the context of short, medium, long term. And we also think about it in that we need to understand the difference between how this is going to impact farmers and how this is going to impact food processors and how kind of all of that fits together. I think often we underestimate the important role that food processing plays in agriculture, and we need to understand that a strong farm gate is stronger when we've got a strong processing sector. And I know that often there can be an antagonistic relationship between farmers and processors, and we don't always kind of play as well as we should, but especially in this world of tariffs when our processed products in Canada, upwards of 80% of most of our processed ag products are exported to the United States. It really is important to understand how that fits together. And so we look at things like, how do we make sure we've got a good tax code? A tax code that encourages investment is a good way to deal with our competitiveness issues. Keep farmers investing in their businesses through this. We look at things like the regulatory landscape. How do we make sure that our regulatory barriers are reasonable? And I think that we've seen over the last decade kind of this push and a lot of concern about the burden in that. So if we want to make our industry more resilient, if we want to make farmers more profitable in this period of chaos, reducing the regulatory burden, make it easier to do business is really important. And then there's this broad swath of trade issues that we need to just double down on trade and market access. And first understand that market diversification is hard. There's a reason why we're so integrated to the United States. It's because it's really easy to do business. I mean, it's close. They speak the same language. They kind of do business on the same terms. And so if we're going to try and pivot away from that into doing markets, an ocean away, doing business in different language on different terms, none of that in and of itself is a bit of a culture change. And in addition to that, we have this world where market access is tough. We've had what had been a very predictable relationship with the United States. But if you look at China and Indonesia, Europe, almost any other place in the world, we get into this world of tariff or non-tariff barriers. And so a big part of it is, on one hand, doubling down on the political and technical resources on market access issues. And then on the second, investing in the trade enabling infrastructure to make it easier to get away. And if we really want to deal with Trump and the uncertainty in the United States, we really should be doing kind of all of those things at once. And it's not easy, but a lot of these things are things we should be doing anyways.
So that actually reminded me of something we've been talking about internally a bit, and wondered about your thoughts on interprovincial trade and the call to increase interprovincial trade. Has your organization been looking at that at all?
It's come up in a lot of conversations. We haven't done kind of a big in-depth project except for meat. And so we'll come back to meat processing in a minute. But often, I think people talk about interprovincial trade barriers the same way we talk about regulatory reform. So I said a minute ago, we need to reduce regulatory burden. But whenever I was back as a political staffer in government, that was always one of those things that would drive me bonkers, because everybody says we need to reduce regulatory burden. But it's really easy to say that. It can be harder to say, here's the specific regulations that are an issue, and here's the specific changes I need to see to do things differently. And I think we see a bit of that with interprovincial trade, where people really like to say we need to reduce interprovincial trade barriers, but sometimes they have a hard time saying this is the specific interprovincial trade barrier that we want to see resolved. We know that there's a big issue in trucking across the country. We know that there's a big issue in accreditation for professionals across the country and labor mobility. And those are big things, but they tend not to be big agriculture things. But meat is different. And I know that when you look at your federal election priorities, I think you're really talking about meat processing as part of that interprovincial trade issue. We have done quite a bit of work on interprovincial trade at CAPI. I worked on this as a political staffer 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, I suppose. It is an interesting challenge in that, especially when you look at beef and pork, the two big ones, most of the beef and pork is slaughtered in a federally inspected plant. And so the provincially inspected facilities tend to be a small piece of the puzzle. They tend not to necessarily be looking at big or interprovincial trade as a big part of their business, but they see it as an opportunity. Again, I think it's a bit different in sheep, where there is more sheep that goes through a provincially inspected slaughterhouse, and that can be an issue at the end of the day. But there's really important, as is often the case with interprovincial barriers, there's like underlying issues for why these things exist. And so on interprovincial or on federally inspected slaughterhouses, the way that international trade works basically says we have to accept meat that comes from a facility in another country that meets our own domestic facility. And right now that is a federal standard. If we said we're going to let meat from a provincially inspected plant trade interprovincially, in theory, we would have to let meat from other countries that meet that same provincial standard into Canada. And the reality is that there's a difference between slaughterhouses in Ontario that are provincially inspected and slaughterhouses in Saskatchewan that are provincially inspected and slaughterhouses in New Brunswick that are provincially inspected. And those Ontario plants may be really close to the federal standard. And that, we need to get some better solutions to make it easier there. But that's not necessarily true of those facilities in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. And so I think it's a good example where we talk about the need to reduce those barriers, but there are times where there are big differences in provinces and how they do things. And so it's not just as simple as waving the wand and making it go away. The government has, on meat inspection, changed a lot of things over the last 20 years to make it easier for a provincially inspected facility to become federally inspected. But that hasn't addressed it all. And I think that there's still a lot of effort around what other creative solutions can we use, but it's not as easy. And I think we often think about alcohol, right, as a good example where, it would be nice if we could move alcohol across interprovincial boundaries easier. Provincial governments don't want to do that because they make a lot of money off of provincial liquor boards and liquor commissions. It's not quite the same on interprovincial meat, but there are some reasons that are there that don't necessarily make it easy to find solutions.
Thank you for the commentary on that. That's some good information. Now, going back to talking about, sort of exports and export opportunities, I know that the sheep industry, not a huge exporter, but the rest of, Canadian agriculture, huge exporter. And your organization has been looking into various opportunities and, to maybe move away from trade relationships with the U.S. and diversify. And one of the places that you're looking is the Indo-Pacific region. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and, what the opportunities are there?
Yeah, it really is a space where there's a tremendous amount of potential, but it's a really good example of how, when you talk at the Indo-Pacific, you're talking about a big region with a lot of different countries that are in very different spaces. And so it's important almost to break the Indo-Pacific down into a couple of big blocks. On one hand, there's China, which is its own complicated market with complicated dynamics, complicated commercial relationships and political relationships. Then we've got countries like Japan and South Korea that are more traditional markets. Those are markets where Canada has a free trade agreement by and large. We've got pretty reliable and reasonable market access. We compete with other countries like the United States in those markets, but we do relatively well. And then you've got this kind of other basket of emerging markets, and that's where Indonesia and some others, the Philippines, play into it, where there's, there are countries that have a growing population, that have a population that are getting richer. Their demand is increasing. There's potential that's there, but they tend to be newer countries. We maybe don't have the same mature trade relationships that we do in Japan. The ability to get products to those markets may be a little bit harder. We're probably still in a lot of cases working through kind of technical market access issues to make it easier to get our products into those markets as well. And so I think again, we've got Japan, South Korea that are relatively easy places to do business. China may be an easy place to do business, maybe not. A lot of risk and uncertainty there, but a huge amount of potential given the size. India, for some products, falls in that same category where big market, big potential demand, but a risky market. And then you've got these emerging markets that are there. And often what our work is looked at in the region is how do we better leverage food security and demand for food in those markets to improve our market access? How do we use that as a tool? And how do we think about it, not just from the context of, we just need to sell them food, but how do we build better relationships? And how do we use that as a way to improve that market access that we have and improve the political relationships that we have? And one of the challenges that we see there is that it's hard to get the government to think about food as more than just a trade issue. And we saw this when the federal government released its Indo-Pacific strategy, where I think that was a huge missed opportunity to think about agriculture and food products from a geopolitical perspective as a kind of a big part of our foreign agenda, foreign affairs agenda in the country. And so that's where our reports have really leaned into. These are how we could do things differently, how we could better leverage food in the region to make it better for our farmers and our food exporters, but also to make it better for the country as a whole. I really think it's important to point out, we take for granted the fact that for a lot of people in the world, eating Canadian food is the one contact that they have with Canada as a country. And I think we should lean into that more often.
Agree wholeheartedly. So, you mentioned the strategy that was released by the government. Now, going into an election, have you seen anything in their policy platforms that would lead you to believe that, either party or any of the three parties are considering food more strategically? What have you seen sort of like just generally in platforms going into the election?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that in general, political parties don't pay as much attention to agriculture issues, certainly as I think that they should. I would imagine as a lot of your members think that they should too. And that, just to kind of highlight that's why, the way that these things get put on the agenda is when, farmers and others, Canadians, talk to the candidates and say, these are the issues that are important. So I know that you guys put out a good document outlining your priorities. So I think it's really important that we keep asking these parties why it is so important that they and highlight why agriculture is so important, and then ask them what they're going to do about it. When I look at what I've seen from the party so far, it really is pretty standard, run-of-the-mill political priorities. One of the unfortunate realities that we have often in Canada, as much as the parties can seem really different on a lot of agriculture issues, it's pretty mushy stuff that can be hard to separate one from the other. Certainly since Mark Carney became leader of the Liberal Party and they abandoned kind of a decade of really strong environmental sustainability priorities and took more of that kind of more of a mainstream middle of the road approach. The edges between them and the Conservative Party have been pretty blurry. So I think what we've typically seen are these kind of high level commitments. We're going to make risk management work better. We're going to, make trade more of a priority. We're going to kind of make it easier. We're going to reduce some of those regulatory burdens. And so, it's good that they're there making ag, that they're making commitments on ag issues. But I think that's a long way from a big vision to understand how important agriculture is and to really make it a part of the agenda going forward. I think the Liberals and Conservatives both have these slogans these days that are somewhere along the lines of Canada strong or Canada first or whatever kind of that sentiment is, that we're gonna kind of rise up and push back against the Americans. And agriculture should be a really big part of making Canada a stronger country. Again, our farmers across the country, our food processors across the country are really important. Food processing is the largest manufacturing sector in the country. I think we often forget that. Farmers are the backbone of rural economies across the country. We don't recognize the value of that enough. And I think it's unfortunate that we don't see the parties embrace the sector more as a driver of how to make Canada stronger. And so, yes, it's good. We see what's there, but I'm always a little bit disappointed that we don't see them go beyond very traditional campaign commitments at the end of the day.
Yeah, it is disappointing. And it's really frustrating too when you look at it. Any other sector can get up and leave.
That's right.
But we are here and committed to the future of this country, for better or for worse. And yeah, a little partnership would go a long way.
Well, and I think it is, and again, often what we see are these kind of the commitments that are very similar almost every election campaign. Again, I think had you asked me this question 6 months ago, I probably could have told you these are what the campaign commitments are going to be, because it's not kind of rocket science. It's very basic. But on the flip side, Aaron, I think that the industry itself and farmers across the country have a role to play in this too, because we need to do a better job demanding better. And one of the kind of challenging political dynamics that we're in is that, by and large, rural Canada votes Conservative, and we do fall into a bit of this trap where the reality is one party may take the sector for granted as it's going to vote Conservative, and the other party may not pay much attention to it because they don't see it as a potential source of votes at the end of the day. And so I do wish that the political parties in Canada thought that they had to work a little bit harder for the farm vote, because I think that might get us better outcomes.
Yeah, I agree as well. Yeah. So you mentioned in your previous answer, you mentioned business risk management. So let's talk about that a little bit, because, everybody's got a business risk management point in their priority list. And we've been through the ringer on business risk management going back, well, as long as I've worked in the sector, which is 25 years. And it doesn't look a lot different. Everybody complains that it doesn't work. So what is the future of business risk management programming in Canada? Is there a way to fix it, especially in the face of budget constraints? Is there a way for it to work?
I think it's important for me to kind of highlight the difference between what I hope and what I think. And I hope that there is a way to fix it. I really am convinced that there are different ways we could do things. One of the things I think a lot about lately is it's an Einstein quote. And Einstein said something along the lines of, if I had an hour to solve the world's problems, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. And I think we've got into a trap in BRM where everybody's got the solutions that they're advocating for at the end of the day. But I think that there's a bit of a need to go back and think about the problems. And when I think about kind of my hope for change, I think because when you think about the problems that are there, if you kind of break them out and get into them, it is like these are not insurmountable problems. But when we live in a world of we need to get governments across the country, the federal government and the provincial governments, to agree, when we do this all through these 5-year Fed-Prov agreements, when we have this space where some provinces, Ontario with RMP being one of them, out doing their own independent things anyways, it makes it really hard to kind of have hope, have optimism that approach is going to drive change at the end of the day. And it is worth highlighting that. I mean, we've seen some minor changes recently, but over the last 25 years of the Fed-Prov agreement, the changes to BRM have largely been to reduce coverage to farmers. It's not governments coming to the table making these things work better. It's governments coming to the table and pulling back that support. But let's go back to the problem on BRM for a minute. I think that you talked about a couple of them. We have a problem that it is a relatively expensive suite, and it's hard to kind of compare apples to apples. But I think when you look at all of those programs together federally, that's crop insurance, agri-stability, agri-invest, and the disaster framework. When you look at that envelope as a whole, that envelope is a lot more expensive now than it was 3 or 4 years ago, largely driven by the cost of crop insurance across the country. But governments spent about twice as much in 2023-24 as they did in 2018-2019 on those programs. That's a very kind of big cost. And I think there's a question around, did farmers feel that they got double the coverage for it, right? So those programs have gotten more expensive, and I don't think farmers see that they're getting the coverage at the end of the day.
Well, some farmers have just left. So they're not getting any coverage at all.
That's right. And I think, Aaron, one of the things that points to, which I think is a kind of a fundamental problem with the suite, is that we do try and offer one set of programs to all farmers across the country. And one thing that's changed in the 25 years that the suite has been in place is that the farmers have gotten a lot more different than they used to be, right? We see this across the country, across the sector. This kind of divide between small farmers and big farmers is really important. If you look at kind of the difference between somebody farming canola and wheat in Saskatchewan versus a sheep farmer in Ontario versus a blueberry farmer in Atlantic Canada, the pressures, the risks that they face are really different. It used to be that weather was like the big risk that farmers would worry about every year. But now it's not just weather, it's what are your input prices doing? It's what are your markets doing? That market concern has been supercharged because of these Trump tariffs. And so we try and funnel all farmers into one set of BRM tools, when I think part of the solution is we need to give farmers more choice. We need to have more flexibility in the programs. We need to create a space where we can better offer sheep farmers tools that work for sheep farmers, rather than offering them tools that work for grains and oilseeds farmers too. Mm-hmm. But that requires creative thinking, that requires governments being willing to do things differently at the end of the day. And I'm not sure that political will is there. I'm not convinced it takes more money. I think that we're spending enough. We have spent a lot on these programs over the last couple of years. It's just a question around, how do we do a better job with the money that we've got? How do we think about this differently? And I think the other thing that we need to think about is, how do we do a better job understanding what can we do from a proactive risk management approach to better tailor the program support, the work the government does, to make sure that farmers aren't relying on these programs as much as they have been, but when they do need them, that they're there and they're able to respond in a way that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All good thinking. So, if we're going to consider the future of agriculture in Canada, what is our country capable of if we get policy right?
So, I often think that one of the problems with politicians is they like to claim credit for things that they don't really deserve credit for. Mm-hmm. And so I often kind of, on a question like this, want to kind of start with the premise that a lot of the success that we have had to date has not been because of this great policy environment that we have. One of the things that we've celebrated last year is that we're effectively at $100 billion of exports in agriculture and agri-food products as a country. That's a big, big number. Huge. But that number is as big as it is largely because of the commodity price hike over the last couple of years. The growth is not because all of a sudden we're producing all of this much more food and it's worth all of this much more money. It's because we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's because of our supply chain disruptions that have wreaked havoc. Now we're seeing issues with tariffs and currency that's causing all of this chaos. So it's almost like we have this large export number in spite of what the government's been doing, because we haven't figured out trade market access issues. We haven't figured out supply chain reliability. We haven't figured out trade infrastructure. And so I often think about it in the context of, just imagine if we did have those things right, if we did have a more profitable sector, if we did have government policy that was really focused on giving farmers the risk management tools that they need, but also the proactive tools around R&D and innovation, how much more we could do that way. And I think it is about looking not just at the farm gate, but at the food processing sector as well, to build a stronger value chain that adds more of that value at home in Canada. And at a high level, that comes back to things like a more profitable sector, more employment in the sector, a more resilient sector, contributing more to that Canada first or that Canada strong language that you need. But ultimately, what it is it makes us a better country. I think that there really is something at the end of the day when you have a stronger agriculture sector as one of those foundational elements as a country. It does make you more independent, and it does make it give you a better chance to succeed, and it does mean that you're less reliant on the big neighbor next door. But we need to understand that we aren't doing well, and I go back to the tariffs. I think one of the things that the tariffs have done is not caused the problems themselves, but have highlighted other problems that we already have today that we need to fix. And if we fix those problems, not only do we do a better job fighting the tariffs, but we do a better job contributing to the success of the country as a whole.
Excellent. So with that in mind, people need to ask their politicians what they plan to do for agriculture to really make sure we can contribute to the success of this country.
Yeah, and I think it is, a couple of other things though to keep in mind, Aaron, about it. This election campaigns are really moments to do this, but this work doesn't stop when the vote happens on April 28th. The role of organizations like the Ontario Sheep Federation and other producer groups across the country is really important, and the commitment that farmers should be making to their farm organizations should be greater now than it's ever been. And I often think that unfortunately in times of kind of instability or volatility, or if we see pressures on farm profitability, there may be this temptation to pull back on farm organizations. And I actually think that the solution is to double down in these times, to invest more, but also to demand more, because we need to make sure that our organizations are representing farmers and standing up for their interests. But part of it is also helping the farmers themselves understand about the broad swath of issues. And I think one of the things that we sometimes fall into a trap in agriculture is, maybe we're asking for something that government is never going to agree to for a variety of different reasons. Maybe we don't understand kind of the broad swath of these other things that are there. And I think we need to do a better job kind of understanding the environment, the changing kind of political and policy environment that we're in, and putting solutions on the table that reflect that. And I will go back and kind of pick on BRM as an example where, we have had, I think for this long time, policy, our asks of governments have been really about kind of tweaking programs and about kind of trying to kind of work around the edges. And I think that we make it easy for government to let this kind of fall into the weeds. And I often wonder how different it would be if we could get farmers across the country to ask for something more meaningful or substantial and come to the table with better solutions at the end of the day. And I think that that's the other thing that, again, everybody needs to work on between elections as well, is how do we do a better job putting policy solutions forward that kind of meet the moment, that are actionable for government, and that increase the odds of success at the end of the day. And I think that that's something that is an important work for the Ontario Sheep Federation and other organizations to do too.
Yep. Collaboration is key. Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's, one of the things, so my first job in politics was working for the federal agriculture minister. And I got to work with farm groups across the country from a variety of different commodities. And one of the things I always think is I took away from that experience was that, we really get caught up in the tyranny of small differences in agriculture. And across the country and across commodities, I often say like 80% of our issues are the same, but we let those 20% of issues really get in the way of collaboration. That's one of the things that we try and do at CAPI, is do kind of survey work and engagement with diverse groups to better understand what are those common issues, common causes. And I think kind of embracing that 80% of things that we have in common is key to collaboration. But sometimes it seems pretty hard in agriculture to look past the 20% of things that are different from one commodity or one region at the end of the day.
Wow. If only we could just have that on repeat, eh? That
And again, it's hard. I mean, it is really, especially when, one sector's success often can be seen to be coming at the expense of the others. And, I think about it kind of in the area in Western Quebec where we live. There is this tension. Land prices around here have skyrocketed, much the same as they have other places. We see our cash croppers that have come in. There's a lot less land that's in hay and pasture here today than there was 25 years ago. And so it's easy, I think, for a beef farmer, for example, or a sheep farmer to grumble about what's happening in grains and oilseeds. But they're not, ultimately what we need to do is find kind of the space where we can all find ways to succeed. And maybe that's not easy, but we'll get more action and traction from government when we go together than when we go separately. And that was always one of the, again, go back to my time as a political staffer, life was always easier whenever every group came with their own little ask, because nobody would ever agree on things. And I think if you look at the success you've finally had on RMP in Ontario, I really do wonder, how much of that comes from the fact that you did have a pretty strong coalition going to governments, continually repeating how important that was. And so I think that should be a model and a way to kind of encourage more of that collaboration going forward.
Absolutely. Well, and I was there at the founding of that group, and really it was, we have to focus on the 80 and leave the 20, and if we just stick with it, and that's what we kept coming back to meeting after meeting. If you just stick with it, that it's always about the timing. It's about staying the course until the timing is right. And with our RMP ask, the timing was right. We got the right ag minister at the right time, just before an election, and the planets aligned, and we were successful. And yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think collaboration, focusing on the 80%, and just sticking with it, even when there's an opportunity that pulls you away to have an opportunity to get that one thing in the 20. Sometimes you just have to leave that and stay focused on the 80%.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things when I was doing government relations consulting work, often would say to people is that, you don't always succeed, right? If the bar that you've set is you're going to win kind of whatever the campaign that you're on is, that's probably not the right bar, because these are long-term efforts, right? And you do need to kind of roll up your sleeves and do hard work over time to get traction at the end of the day. And that's something that again can be frustrating when you don't always get it when you ask for it. But as you say, when you kind of understand all of the different parts that are there, you understand about kind of sometimes you need to be in that right moment, and it helps kind of put the context around it. But I think if you see that on BRM, I think that there's other files where we should be seeing more of that. R&D, that research and development space, I think is a really good example where I think that there is an opportunity for farmers and food processors and others in the ag industries to come together more around that now. I think if you think about the future and the issues around productivity, profitability that the sector faces, I think R&D is going to be a big part of it, but we don't do well on R&D in this country. And I'm hopeful that in the kind of the short to medium term, we'll see more of that collaboration on that issue going forward as well.
That's amazing. Well, Tyler, I think we're going to leave it there for the time, but I really appreciate you joining today, and really appreciate all your insights. And I hope we get to work together on some of this policy setting in the future. I think there's a real opportunity to work with CAPI and our other colleagues in Ontario and across the country to set some big priorities and do some of that collaboration work. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. I look forward to working together in the future.
Amazing. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Flock Talk, please subscribe to your podcast app to receive alerts for our future episodes. And please share our podcast with your friends. For more Ontario Sheep Farmers content, follow us on social media at Ontario Sheep Farmers on Instagram and Facebook, at Ontario Sheep on X, and visit our website at ontariosheep.org.